Of all the daylight raids over Germany, one day stood out among the rest, marking a pivotal moment in the strategic air war over Europe. That day was October 14th, 1943, a day that the young men of the 8th Army Air Force would come to refer to as Black Thursday. It would become known as one of the pivotal and devastating air battles of the Second World War, unprecedented in its scale and ferocity. As they approached their target, the B-17s were met with an overwhelming force of German fighter planes. The B-17S suffered devastating losses. It was the heaviest loss in a single mission suffered by the U.S. Air Force in the entire course of World War II. Most of those scheduled to fly that day were awakened at 2 a.m. for breakfast before heading to their respective briefings. The majority of the flight crew were chatting away inside the briefing tent, but when they pulled back the curtain and revealed the map, there was a brief moment of silence before a moan was heard. Some men stood cursed and expressed their bitter dissatisfaction. The target for today is Schweinfurt.
Everyone knew when you went to a place like Schweinfurt, you were going to really be in for a rough day.
I was the only guy walking on the road to the mess hall, and I really did talk to the man, and I said, I don't think I can make this, you know.
A major hub deep inside Germany for the production of ball bearings, a critical component for the German war machine. As a result, its factories were heavily defended by extensive anti-aircraft installations and a strong contingent of Luftwaffe fighters. Despite the significant losses sustained during the initial Schweinfurt raid 2 months ago, the generals planned an even bigger raid this time, taking into account the lessons learned from the first. However, after the initial raid, the Germans increased the number of fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft guns in and around Schweinfurt, making the air defenses much stronger and more effective.
We were replacements for the ones that were shot down, but the remaining guys were really bad. Man. They'd sort of walk around like zombies, and you'd talk to them, and if they had 6 missions in, you'd say, God, you're a hero, you know, you can't do that. How can you live? How can you still be here?
The first raid had met with heavy resistance, suffered significant losses, and the veterans knew full well that a similar fate awaited them.
I can't remember the fellow's name, but he wasn't very encouraging. He says, don't unpack your locker bag, he says. They'll be sending it home to your mama soon.
Before every mission, he would go out and quietly throw up in the hard stand out behind the airplane. Anyway, he always went.
With final preparations completed, young men, most in their early 20s, prepared to embark on this perilous mission. A force of 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from various bases in England.
I was more frightened of takeoffs than anything else. I had seen a crew that took off with a load of bombs, and they didn't make it. And they had 24 missions in. They had one more to go, and they were all killed.
When you did get in that B-17, heavily loaded as it was, and you started walking those throttles forward, the momentum pressed you back into your seat, and you just kept moving those throttles against the wall, and the old bird would slowly gain momentum, and she started building speed, and you kept waiting for just a little bit of indication that she was ready to fly. And when she finally did take off and clear of the brush at the end of the runway, you knew it was, you'd had some real excitement.
They head towards Germany, forming up into large groups known as combat box formations for mutual protection.
Perhaps the riskiest part of any mission is to take off in a whole group through a dense cloud without any notion of where other planes might be. So there is always the danger of collision.
Due to bad weather and intense anti-aircraft fire, bomber formations over the Netherlands dispersed and became more exposed.
If it was a clear day, the atmosphere was such that we would make these long, long contrails, and it could be seen from 100 miles away. The Germans didn't have any problem spotting us.
It seemed that no sooner when the tail of our friendly fighter escort was still visible going home, and here comes the nose of the Luftwaffe.
The B-17 crews were aware that they would now be on their own for the remainder of the trip to Schweinfurt as the bomb groups crossed the border into Germany and the fuel-strapped Allied fighters reluctantly turned for home. Without the protection of their escorts, the bomber crews waited as the German fighters climbed toward them like angry hornets.
It wasn't very long before we could see through our windshield it was coming. It was German fighters. We thought about 200 or 300 of them at the time, like a swirl of beads coming out of the distance. And they went through us, just a cloud went by us. And when it went by, the first time, our entire high squadron, 9 airplanes, was gone. We just took them right out. Raided us a total of 3 times, and by the time the 3rd raid was over, we found ourselves sitting alone.
There were so many coming in from all directions, they risked colliding with one another.
I was sitting behind them in a bomber column and watched them being decimated. The German fighters were working over them, and I kept thinking, pretty soon we'll be up there.
The bombers were torn apart by machine guns and cannon as successive waves of fighters sliced through them like a scythe.
As they turned into us, and of course they were head-on attacks, and you could see them blinking to those 30 millimeters coming at you. But they were so rapid that if you were hit, one moment you were flying without any damage, and the next moment you were in trouble.
The frontal attacks were a terrifying experience for the American pilots, who were literally staring death in the face as the onrushing fighters came straight at them at closing speeds of over 500 miles per hour. Heavy fighting on other missions had resulted in significant losses, but never at the rate seen on this particular day. There were more German aircraft than any of the crews had ever seen.
We were flying with engine and rudder is all we had left. And it's a kind of a dying swan sort of a thing. There's no way you're going to recover. You're going down, you know it, but you're giving the people a chance to get out.
Without the threat of escort fighters, F-W-190s and Me-109s had time to use their 20mm cannons to devastating effect. The B-17's fuselage could be torn apart by these deadly projectiles like it was made of paper. Watching the death throes of a stricken B-17 was a gut-wrenching sight, for it clearly demonstrated to the others the fate that could befall them at any moment. Few were immune to the sheer terror of these relentless attacks.
So when I dropped through that bomb bay opening, you just can't believe the quietness out, and yet you see all this activity going. Airplanes and bomb bursts, and you see planes going down, and I could see my plane slowly spiraling towards the ground with this long stream of flame coming out of it. And of course you hope and pray that every one of your members got out.
I was scared. Everybody was scared.
I started to jump. I looked back and saw the radio operator laying on the floor of the radio room with his right leg all bloody. Went back and got his chute, got it on him, and got him to the waist door. There's nothing going past that door but just fire. And he kind of locked up on the door, and I had to jerk him loose from that, throw him out the door so I could get out.
Schweinfurt was only a few minutes away, and most of the bombers had reached the target despite the brutal fighter assaults. As the B-17 bombers approached Schweinfurt, they found themselves flying into a maelstrom of intense anti-aircraft fire. The sky was filled with black puffs of smoke, each one an exploding shell that could tear a bomber apart. Shrapnel hammered against the aircraft's fuselage, a deadly hail that could puncture the skin of the aircraft, destroy engines, and even detonate the bombs within the B-17's payload bays.
Flak is, I guess, probably the roughest part of a bombing mission. You can't shoot back at it. You can't do anything about it. All you can do is fly through it.
If you weren't hit, you felt the concussion of the vacuum where the shell exploded, and then the airplanes would buffet along through that.
Bombardiers peering through their bomb sights focused on the target below, waiting for the exact moment to release their payloads. The theory of precision bombing would be severely tested over Schweinfurt because the factories were spaced well apart near residential areas, making them difficult targets to pinpoint. From 20,000 feet up, the explosive firestorm that swept over the town looked awesome. As a column of smoke began rising from Schweinfurt, the B-17s reformed into their combat wings, and the crews steeled themselves for the gauntlet of German fighters on the way home.
The other waist gunner was thrown against the tail wheel strut, and I was thrown against him. The plane went into a dive, and I can remember him screaming in my ear, and I could feel his head just crushing underneath, you know, my weight. That plane went down.
You see a B-17 start circling down with smoke coming out of its engines, you know that it's not a game anymore, that there's some death going on there.
If he says he wasn't scared, he wasn't there.
Many aircraft were damaged, some critically, adding to the hazard as crippled bombers trailing smoke dropped out of formation, their crews fighting to keep them airborne. As the gunners frantically fired their machine guns, called out approaching fighters, or attempted to aid injured comrades, the aircraft was filled with the overpowering smell of burned cordite.
The life expectancy of air crew along about that period was about 6 to 8 missions. And if you got past that, you were kind of making it on borrowed time.
Any B-17 that displayed obvious signs of damage was quickly identified by skilled Luftwaffe pilots. For the crippled bombers, which lost height and fell from the protection of the formation, the chances of survival were less than zero. Alone and vulnerable, few got far before being set upon by fighters and hacked out of the sky. Some German pilots who had steely nerves pressed their attacks to within 50 yards before breaking off into a half roll or diving away before turning around again.
I had a new man on my wing, and he got hit, and he was just a burning. I tried to tell him, get out of here, bail out. You can't say anything. There's, you know, you can't. There's radio silence. You can't talk. And you try to motion to him, go away. I was trying, and the co-pilot was looking at me, and they're flying right beside me still. And I finally, they did peel off, and I never did know what happened to them. They never made it back. I imagine they crashed. It was just blazing away, you know.
The way back from Schweinfurt is a nightmare vision, which I think all of us who were on that mission still carry with us.
What remained of the bullet-riddled bomber force limped across the North Sea toward England. Many of the damaged fortresses landed on the first airfield they could find.
Flying home, combat's over, then the things start to occur to you that there's a lot of airplanes missing someplace. You wonder where they are. And you hope that they just got scattered and turn up. But when you get close to home, you know, and you're all alone going to your base, you know that there's something wrong because there's nobody else around you going your way. And when you come into the field and circle around, get ready to land, you see a lot of empty fighting spaces.
No one had ever seen anything like the events of this day. For the ground staff waiting at the bases, the gaps in the formations came as a terrible shock. The aerial combat over Schweinfurt was fierce and costly, but the Luftwaffe's coordinated attacks took a heavy toll on the B-17 formations. By the end of the day, 77 B-17s had been destroyed, representing a staggering loss of more than 26% of the attacking force. Another 121 had varying degrees of battle damage. Losses among air crew were equally severe, with 650 men lost. The 305th Bomb Group in particular was badly hit, with 87% of its manpower failing to return.
And we immediately met by our squadron commander, who wanted to know what had happened. How do you tell him what's happened? How do you know what's happened, other than there are no other aircraft around and the crews didn't come back? He started to cry. And when he started to cry, I guess we all started to cry. It was a shocking moment to realize that you alone had come back, and all the others had not.
He'd cry so much sometimes, but I'd always try to go someplace where somebody wasn't around and weep for my friends and my crew members that were killed. And it started taking its toll on people. You know, sometimes you'd be cursing God and praying to him at the same time.
Although the Schweinfurt factories were badly hit, the mission failed to achieve any lasting effect. The severe losses led to a reevaluation of daylight, unescorted bombing, resulting in the suspension of deep raids into Germany until the introduction of long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang in February 1944.
The mood in headquarters might have been desperate after Schweinfurt. They might have realized then the grand strategic bombing was not quite the neat way of the surgical method to be used to end a war.
The second Schweinfurt raid was a testament to the resolve and bravery of the young men of the 8th Army Air Force who flew that day and paid a heavy price in lives lost. for the promise of a world that one day would be free from the tyranny of Nazi rule.
If you liked this video, there are many similar high-quality videos on my channel.